Good afternoon, and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professionals webinar, Critical Thinking Better Together. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide, please. My name is Shanta Bulai, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs we offer, the college's contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. I'm delighted to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Critical Thinking Better Together. We rarely make decisions alone. We solve problems in meetings, coordinate across teams, and rely on one another to make sense of complex situations. Critical thinking then isn't just an individual skill, it's a collaborative one. When we think with others, we expand our perspective and improve the quality of our decisions. This webinar explores what critical thinking looks like in shared environments where assumptions, group dynamics, and habitual advice given can cloud our judgment. Whether you're leading discussions, working through tough conversations, or helping a team slow down and analyze a situation, you'll learn practical ways to ask better questions and reach clearer, more grounded decisions together. By the end of the session, participants will be able to recognize how habits like advice giving can limit collaborative thinking, reflect on how assumptions and emotions influence group decisions, ask questions that lead to clearer and more productive conversations, and lastly, support others in clarifying facts, testing assumptions, and broadening perspectives. It's a pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Nan Gesche. Nan is an educator, speaker, and coach, and now author, who aims to help people play well together. She has guided organizations through change management, resiliency building, and conflict management for 20 years. Nan, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Shanta. Wow, that's a really long description. Hopefully we can squeeze that all in such a short period of time. Before we really get started, I want to ask you three questions, and you can comment in the chat or think about them to yourself. But my questions often are starting with, who here feels like their teams or their decisions are being forced to be made faster than ever? Okay. I'm guessing most of us do feel that way. Yes, it's like absolutely. And we think about that, and not only do we have to make decisions faster, here who unfortunately has seen some of those decisions go back for rework later. Have any of you experienced that? Forced to make a decision quickly, but then later on, you're forced to go back and figure out how do we rework some of those decisions. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, we don't always think about the downstreaming impact. So, absolutely. Now, my last question for you, and that's probably part of the reason you're here, is who here believes they personally have all the answers? Okay. Yeah, nope, I love that. Right off the bat, somebody right off the bat. And unfortunately, we've been trained, though, many times to make decisions quickly by ourselves because we don't have a lot of time. And so we often think that speed, and pressure is part of the problem, but part of it is our conditioning and how we learn to think and how we should be thinking with other people. So thank you for some of those comments. Yeah, my staff thinks so. I love that. We can talk about that later. So it's not uncommon when my clients call me, they often will ask, well, Nan, we know that you teach problem solving and decision making. I have a class here at the university through the CCAPS program, critical thinking and problem solving. And they always say, well, how can we make decisions faster? And my question for them is, well, do you want to be efficient or do you want to be effective? So is it just about making the decision or is it about durability? Is it about coming up with solutions that can be implemented that people buy into, that the results really get you what you're looking for? And so it's not that we struggle with hiring good people and that we don't have intelligent people on their team. What we struggle with is how do we think effectively when we are under some of those time pressures that we are all facing on our jobs. And so we don't necessarily want to prioritize efficiency because when we do, we end up with rework, misalignment, frustration. And so the goal is today to think better together and to think more critically. Now, my definition of critical thinking is probably very different than other people's, and you come to the course and we get into the five components in greater detail. But the way I like to think of critical thinking is we all have an internal decision team. It's kind of like our own personal board of directors that we have. And most of us understand that critical thinking is about our head, okay? That there's logic, there's analysis, and there's information. A good critical thinker also understands the value of heart. Do you understand what your emotions are and how they impact your thinking? Do you know what your values are to inform better decisions? Do you know what the values of other people who will be impacted by the decision? It's also thinking with your gut that there actually is, some instinct and experience that helps us make better decisions and think more critically, even when we can't articulate it, sometimes through logic. Now, those are probably the three most common, and I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. But we also have to think about having an open mind that oftentimes we get new information and are we willing to look at that information? But the last piece I think that's here is that our personal boardroom should always have a seat at the table for somebody else. Because as you said in my question earlier, do you have all the answers to everything? Absolutely not. No one has a whole picture, and we need to leave a seat at the table for other people. The harder part of this is trying to recognize when do we leave a seat? And we need to leave a seat when we know that other people are going to be impacted by our decision. Okay. And so that's when we need to engage other people. We have to know what their values are. We need to know what their impact is. And so that's that heart component. We also need to stay open to other people around us because there's always new information that they're gleaning that sometimes we don't. Now, if our personal board of directors, our internal decision team does not include others, it's what I often refer to as thin thinking. Thin thinking is that it's efficient and it's fast, but it's not, as I said, rarely is effective. And we default to this because of time pressures. We know we're good at certain things. Many of us have been promoted because we are good critical thinkers and we're good decision makers. And so we learn to rely on that strength. It's fast and it's comfortable and it's quick, but it doesn't go back to durability. And just because it's a good decision doesn't mean that it's going to get implemented. So I just want to ask you quickly, we're going to do a quick Mentimeter slide up and there it went again. We just tested it before and it didn't work. Let me go to the other app that I have up. Yeah, this sometimes happens. It's just life, it seems like when we use technology. Is my question for you is, what do you use most? And so with this, you can see QR code. There is a QR code. Oh, maybe we're not going to get that today. Yeah, Grayson, we tested
I
it
think
all.
maybe Nan, if you click the start presentation button in that top corner,
There it is. There it is. Yeah,
that should
because
work.
I had it, we had it built into the slide and it was
There we
working.
go.
There it isn't. So if you take a picture of the QR code, and if that doesn't work, you can type in Menti and then the 3990, the number that's given there. Which do you tend to rely on the most? Okay. And so I always find this really an interesting piece to find because when I talk about critical thinking, most of us have probably been told that to think critically, it's all about your head. It's all about the logic. It's about the analysis. And a good critical thinker will tell you that sometimes there's more to that. And so I appreciate some of you even putting in the chat, what you use. If you're not as comfortable using the polling, feel free to put it in the chat. But it does look like the majority of you do count on using your head. And our internal decision, so we have a voice that tends to speak loudest for us. But the other question of that is if we're listening to the voice that speaks the loudest, what voice are we missing? Okay. And all perspectives are valid. All perspectives have something to contribute to thinking critically. So if we don't include thinking with our head, heart, and our gut, we aren't getting the whole picture. Okay. The whole person doesn't amplify all the data points. And so I often say to somebody, like, if you know you're really good at thinking with your head, are you connecting with people who are really looking at this from the perspective of others? And so we need to think about, again, what person aren't we inviting or what way aren't we inviting to the table? And how can we do that going forward? Now, another polling question then for you then is the second one is, yes, here we go. Come on. Is what's most rewarded in your organization? Because it's not just what you do naturally, it's also thinking about what is rewarded in your organization. Because what we do isn't just about what we're comfortable with, it's also about what's rewarded in our organization. And ideally, I love seeing what I'm seeing already, is that in an ideal world, it should be about implementation success. But as some of you are indicating, that sometimes speed is important. Okay. And sometimes it's thorough analysis. I used to work for a consulting firm, Arthur Andersen, that would be like Accenture today. And a lot of times people want to make a thorough analysis. And one of the things we were taught is that 100% answer that people don't buy into because we haven't thought about the impact to others and their feelings is not a good answer if it doesn't get implemented. And so analysis is important, but is it done at the expense of having a right answer versus an answer that people can buy into? That I was taught that a 70% answer that people can buy into oftentimes is more effective because you're going to create momentum. And so it's understanding that critical thinking can be looked at from different perspectives. And so something to think about. Now, with that, if we want to think with others, oftentimes, if we know someone actually who has the courage to ask for some help, we often shortchange the critical thinking process by giving them the answers. We give them free advice. And yet, when I ask people, what do you do with most of the free advice people give you? They're like, yeah, in one ear, out the other. It's like they don't really listen to it, they don't use it. So, why do we think our free advice is so good? Okay, I get that you're getting free advice today. Take that with a grain of salt. So, do with it as you please. But when we give advice, again, sometimes we are slipping into that pattern of thinking alone, okay? And we also are sometimes making the assumption or signaling to the other person that maybe we don't trust their thinking, but we have to remember we don't hold all the data, we don't see all the consequences, we don't see all the impact, we don't have all the lenses they have. So rather than giving advice, maybe we think about how do we ask really good questions? And we're going to tap into that a little bit later in the webinar, where we talk about some examples of what are better questions to help yourself and other people to think more critically. So we have to get out of that habit of giving advice, and that's really hard to do sometimes. There's a book called The Coaching Habit, and I love that book because they really talk about asking those good questions and instead of giving advice. And the author of that book talks about what he calls the advice monster. It doesn't serve us or our team members very effectively if we want them to think critically. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example or case study, and I want you to think about this. And this is something we dig more deeply into the full class, is that if you were told by someone, your supervisor, that you needed to fire on someone on your team, do you see that as a problem or is that a decision? And so go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat. Is that a problem or a decision? Okay. It's a little bit of everything. Thorough analysis. Yeah. It's both. It's a decision. Okay. So a lot of you are saying it's a decision. Some of you are saying it's both. Some of you are saying a problem. On the surface, I think most of us do see that as a decision. Okay. But I'm going to give you a quick story. And this is one of the things that changed my perception of critical thinking and the need to think together is that a good friend, Dick, basically went to work one day and his supervisor said, "Hey, I was told I was supposed to fire one of you." Okay. He's like, "I don't want to fire any of you. There's no compensation, there's no packages. You're a great team, don't want to do this." So he said, I went to my manager and asked him, "What's the bigger problem going on right now that's causing you to ask me to fire someone?" Well, in most of our organizations, we're asked to fire someone when expenses are up and revenue is down. And sometimes that's the path organizations will take in order to eliminate or, to free up cash flow in the organization. But he knew that if he fired someone when he didn't have a good reason for firing any of them, there were no performance issues, nobody wanted to go, there was no severance package. He knew that would probably have a negative impact to his team. Because if you fire someone and you don't have a good reason, what might happen? What might happen to productivity and morale? Think it's going to go up? Okay. Probably not. So I'm just watching the chat and I notice some of you are commenting on that. Absolutely. It's absolutely going to go down. Morale and productivity will plummet. It's going to devastate the team. People are going to want to leave. Morale might already be low. There's going to be a lot of resentment. And so we have to watch out for those things. But luckily, the supervisor was, oh, and I love that. It erodes trust totally, which makes it difficult going forward. So, what I loved about this supervisor is that this supervisor went back to his manager and said, "Are there any options? What else can we do?" And the manager then explained what the situation was and basically said, "You need to cut money by the end of the week. I don't care how you do it, it just has to happen." And so he went back to his team. The supervisor went back to his team. He was transparent about the situation and he said, "I don't have the answer for this. I don't want to fire any of you. I don't think any of you want to go. Can you come up with some ideas?" And so the team, yeah, absolutely. Great comments. You lose expertise, but they went back to the team. The team basically came back and made the comment that, "Hey, fishing season has started. There were a lot of sportsmen on the team, and they're like, if you can give us a more flexible schedule," and this was before COVID, and people were really good at working remote. "You give us a flexible schedule, we will temporarily take a pay cut." Okay. And if we can't figure out a solution within 6 months after fishing season in summer, they were like, then we can have a discussion about firing someone. Okay. Now, what do you think happened to productivity and morale after that conversation? Yeah, it went up. It increased. Trust went up, collaboration went up. And what do you think happened in 6 months? Yeah, they solved the problem. Absolutely. And not only did they solve the problem, they continued to build their trust, their creativity, their motivation. And I think each of them felt valued as team members. And this is one of the things that, I'm a huge teamwork person. That's where my expertise lies. And I teach problem solving because it's a tool set and a skill set that helps us build collaboration and teamwork. Okay. But we have to teach people to think critically, and better thinking happens by widening our view. It's all part of critical thinking. Okay. And in this case, it was shifting from thinking we had a decision to moving to we have a problem to solve. And so it creates options instead of a reaction. Okay. And there are so many opportunities in our lives where we think we have to make a decision. And if we really think critically and learn to ask some good questions of other people, we will discover that we have more options and different avenues that we can take than we realize. And that's why thinking critically, I will often say, is a team sport. And to me, then it's really important to think about how do we engage others in an effective way? How do we invite them into our personal board of directors? Okay. Yeah, that's why the context and getting to the root of the issue really matters. You need to see things from multiple perspectives. And so, short term efficiency, the short term efficient thing to do was just to fire someone, but the long term effective solution was to reframe how we saw the situation or the perceived problem or the decision. And so, in this case, he didn't really think harder, he thought better, he thought smarter, and he did that by engaging others. And I think we've all heard the story of when a person, is looking at an elephant and they have a blindfold on and they can only touch one part of the elephant, they're going to describe it very differently. Okay. Because they don't see the whole picture. And because of our different experiences, our different levels in the organization, the different jobs we've had, our different cultures, our different educations, we see problems and situations differently. And so the goal again is by thinking with others, how do we expand our lens? And part of the way we do that is making sure that when we do invite somebody to the table with us to expand our internal board, who are we inviting? And we have to think about who those people are. And the first place we need to consider are who are the stakeholders? Who are those people who are going to be impacted by our decision? And when we think about the impact of the decision, it oftentimes we're thinking of the decision itself, but especially from an organizational perspective, but even a personal perspective, I like to get people to think about their inputs, throughputs, and outputs. Okay. That the throughput is us making the decision or running the business, but who are people who are providing us input, whether it's workers or supplies or perspective, and what are our output, who are our customers, who are the end users, the people who market our product. When we think about them, on some level, they are also stakeholders in decisions we make. Now, they might not be as big of a stakeholder as the people who are making the decision, who live with it maybe daily, but we have to think about that our definition of stakeholders is often very limited and we need to stretch that. So when I work with a group, I challenge them to think about who are all the stakeholders that could be touched by this. And then you have to get into, and I'm not going to talk about it, but you can do, like a RACI um, uh, assessment where who are the people who just need input versus who are the people who really need to be part of the decision. But you have to start with identifying all the people who are impacted. Now, the other part of this conversation, if you're going to invite somebody to the table, is that oftentimes we go to the easiest people, the people who have similar thinking many times as we do. Sometimes they have the same experience, the same perspectives, the same beliefs, the same values, and not necessarily a bad thing because sometimes it's good to validate and have that support. The risk of that, though, is that we don't stretch our thinking and we don't see things from other perspectives. And so we all need a support network to encourage us and reinforce us. We also need that challenge network who's going to stretch our thinking. And when we do that, it can become uncomfortable. Okay. Thinking together isn't always easy, but we have to remember that part of critical thinking isn't just for the solution, it's about the implementation, it's about the follow through. And we need that challenge network to stretch us so that we see again through that broader lens. Now, if we are going to do this, it is going to require, so I often think, it's a mindset, a skill set, and a tool set. The mindset is, are we open to bringing people into our board of directors? The skill set right now is, are we any good at asking questions so that we can actually leverage the other people that we're bringing into the conversation? Okay. So, one of my favorite new books out there is The Power of Mattering by Zach Mercurio. And I love that because I should have stolen it from him or thought of it sooner. He uses the Nan model, notice, affirm, and need, I use something slightly different. But one of the things he talks about in the book is learning to ask really good questions. And learning to ask good questions is really hard. We need to ask questions that ideally start with what and how. In my world, I like to use those two words to start asking questions versus who, when, where, and why, because why can feel judgmental and the other words are closed-ended questions. But even then, with what and how questions, we can make them so much more powerful by asking, like, how was that project launch? Instead of just saying, how was that project launch? We can say, what part of the project was most successful? What part do we need to tweak for next time? So instead of just asking for a perspective, it's analyzing the situation more deeply. You instead of saying, did we hit the goal? You can ask what helped us move closer to the goal. What are the things, again, do we need to continue to reinforce? If you're going to ask the question, what did go wrong? Are you also following up with what did we learn? Okay. So it's to stretch our critical thinking and their critical thinking about how are we going to continue to improve our processes and our ways of working together. And, sometimes you can just ask them also as an individual, how was your performance? Again, dig deeper and ask them, what are they most proud of? Okay, what was the part they want to change? Because you have to think critically, both from the perspective of the process that the team is implementing, as well as how each of the players on the team contributed. Okay. Um, yeah, it's mastering what questions you use. And sometimes, yeah, in all areas of our lives and learning management, why questions can be difficult, because it often does make people defensive. Yeah, having a debrief, like great comment, Lori. Having a debrief is so critical to the success of any organization and any project that you're working on. But we often forget that it can happen at the end of every meeting, at the end of every interaction. Like what could we do differently to improve how we work together? How could we improve those dynamics? Where do you see my gaps? What gaps do I have that you can help balance out? How can I leverage your skills more effectively so we can think better together? And so it's recognizing personally, and we don't get into it here, we each need to know what our strengths are. And that's why I asked you head, heart, and gut, but it's also thinking about, personality assessments. What are your strengths when you are viewing situations? Okay. Are you more analytical? Are you more relational? Are you more spatial? Are you more, we all have different types of intelligences, and recognizing that we all have gaps and we all have voids. Yes. Yeah, and I love, Michael, you're talking about AI, because AI is becoming a great tool sometimes to help us think critically. Like, yes, AI does have hallucinations, but sometimes it's a great tool if you don't have somebody else present in the moment. I use A quite a bit to be like, help me think through this. How could I see this differently? What are the other options? What questions haven't I asked that I should be considering? Okay. Haven't read the book, Extreme Ownership, but thank you for mentioning that, Laura. It's good to know that people are sharing resources out there with each other. So I love these sessions because you can learn not just from the instructor, but all the resources people are listing in the chat. Okay. So one of the things we have to think about is the blind spots that we all have. Oftentimes we're accused of that being a people problem, like we need more education, we need to up our skills. Part of it is a mindset that we have to be recognizing that we all have limited time, limited resources. We can't remember everything. So how do we really sort through and tap into those other people who do think differently and who have different experiences? Okay. Because we do need to focus on decision quality, implementation, and effectiveness, but we also have to consider engagement. Okay. So oftentimes, though, it's a design problem. Have we created systems in our lives, in our organization, where we know how to use different tools? And those tools are often things that will help leverage other people. So we often have to reframe and recognize that blind spots don't exist because people don't share their ideas. Sometimes they exist because we haven't created a system to support their sharing of ideas. We don't design systems that support conversation that actually encourage and leverage the differences. Like I know so many people when I work with teams or I'm coaching individuals, the comment will be, well, I don't want to disagree in a meeting because if I disagree in a meeting, the meeting's going to last longer and then everyone's going to hate me. Nobody wants to go to any more meetings. And so, do we use some structured processes can we, excuse me, identify some structured processes um, that will help stretch our thinking and make sure the voices, all the voices in the room that we need to hear from are actually being accessed. So it isn't so much that silence is the issue, it's knowing that the silence itself means we've lost some voices in the process. And so learning to use structured thinking helps us be more effective. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but this is where coming to the full class on the critical thinking and problem solving, we spend a lot of time going into structured problem solving and decision making. Okay. Well, thank you. Shanta has a comment in there about if you are wanting to interact. So, structured thinking, in my mind, sometimes people don't like structured tools, partly because they may not be as comfortable with them. They may not be familiar with them. They may feel like they lose some control in the process. But really, it's about creating space for shared thinking. Decisions aren't just about making the decision, but it's making sure that they make sense to the people who have to live by the decision who weren't necessarily part of the decision. And so the structured processes create space, okay, and yet they also are very useful for making sure that you have the insight from all the people in the room, the quieter voices are engaged, and sometimes the voices that aren't heard as often, maybe not because they're quieter, but they need time to think and process. So we talk about how you time decision making, and you can stretch structured processes out to be more effective. When you do that, hopefully we come up with some more effective, wiser decisions because it isn't just about the decision. Again, it's about the implementation and the engagement for better outcomes. Let's see, the power of mattering. No, thank you somebody for putting in that in there. And then Cindy has got a comment. If I don't feel comfortable bringing up an issue in a meeting for various reasons, I'll take one of the meeting leaders aside after absolutely the meeting and bringing up my thoughts. Okay. And that's a great way to do that. I think as meeting, if you're the leader, it's always effective to send out agendas and give people heads up because oftentimes this is also the value of structured thinking is maybe if we use structured processes, we don't have to have the meeting after the meeting. The goal is, in my mind, is to teach some structured processes, which I would call the meeting before the meeting, teach people how to use tools like multi-voting, decision matrix, affinity diagrams, using these different tools and taking the time in the meeting before the meeting. Maybe you won't need the time in the meeting after the meeting. So just kind of my perspective on that. And so in the class, we spend a lot of times talking about structured processes. Now, for our purposes today, we're not going to spend time on structured processes as much as just using. I'm having you use these polling slides because they are an example of a structured process. It's a way of thinking together to consolidate information pretty quickly without somebody feeling like they're put on the spot or they're made to feel uncomfortable. And I think some of the people made that comment about instead of pulling somebody aside, if you use these processes. So, just a quick question for you. If you're thinking of a decision that your team has made recently, what was missing? Like, if you've ever had to do any rework, I'm guessing some of you have done some rework. Oh, thank you again for those people who, Michael Bengay Stainer, he goes by MBS. Um, yeah, I love that. Okay, so think of a rework. What was missing from the conversation? And I love the first response in the chat. There were people who were missing from the table. Okay. We didn't get input from certain people. We made some assumptions about what people felt. Not everyone had a voice. Okay. Sometimes we have issues. The supervisor, the people who are the ones who have the resources, who have the credibility or the power in order to make things happen. Sometimes it's that we don't have clear goals and expectations. Sometimes we have changing priorities. And if we don't have people who are part of the strategic plan and know what's going on, it's hard to know how to make a good decision. And yes, occasionally we have incomplete information, and we're going to have to make decisions many times with incomplete information. Yeah, absolutely. Project creep. Okay. That will happen. And unequal voices. Okay. And then deciding not to really hear others. And again, that's why I love structured tools, because when you use structured tools, like when we did the polling, every one of you who chose to engage in the polling, and I gave you the option to comment in the chat, all voices were heard. Now, ideally, you have to make sure everyone has the same access to the technology. They have the same comfort with the technology. And so, again, you may have to train people on how to use technology and how to use the tools. But when we do that, all the things that you're talking about here will be addressed. You're not thinking about the impact. We're not thinking about everybody. We're not clear about our deliverables. Okay. So when we start to be more thoughtful about our processes, okay, we will have more information. We will get more input. We will unpack some of those assumptions. We will gain clarity. We will improve communication. Most of the time, again, the issue isn't intelligence. It's just working our way through the data in a way that can help us make decisions fairly quickly. Okay. We know that hindsight is always 2020, but having tools on the front end will help us. So management decisions on the path forward without input from somebody who's impacted. Absolutely. So we're going to do one more poll. Um, Yes, we are past the halfway mark. Is the poll, the last poll, the Menti poll, is actually a slightly different poll in that it is a word cloud. Because I just want to ask you, a project manager left your meeting early. What word or two or what idea comes to mind? I love that right away. Irritating. It's like you needed to be here because you had some expertise. Okay. It's frustrating, it's confusing, it's annoying. It sends the message that maybe they're not dedicated, they're incompetent, they don't really care, they're not good at prioritizing, they're careless, they've abandoned the team. Not a lot of good words there, are there? Okay. I'm letting people continue to add their words. Okay. Yeah, a lot of times we just want to ask the question, why? Why are they doing that? Because it does feel disrespectful, confusing, rude, um, and it does feel really annoying to us. Right? Now, my question for you, and you can kind of put that in the chat. How many of you have ever had to leave a meeting early and you weren't able to explain why, but it was for a very valid reason? What might be the valid reasons for people leaving a meeting early? Yeah, all kinds of. Yeah, you had an emergency call, a family issue, there was another commitment, a high priority issue. Maybe the big boss pulled you out. Okay. Mental health. Okay. We have to be able to take care of ourselves. An upset stomach, nature calls sometimes. That's the reality of life. Now, part of the reason I had you do the poll, and then I'm asking you this question, is that many times we make a lot of assumptions about what is going on, and those assumptions aren't necessarily valid assumptions. Okay? And we have to be careful about making assumptions. And we all make assumptions. Okay. And we know what happens. To make an assumption is to make an ass out of you and me. And so part of the reason for structured processes is to help us avoid making assumptions. Okay. Because we tend to jump from data to meeting. Someone left the meeting, so they don't care. And you've given me all examples in the chat how that's not true. That's just an assumption. And that's the value of a structured process, is that using structured processes helps us unpack what I refer to as the ladder of inference. The ladder of inference means we don't know why they left. We selected data and we made up a story. It's funny because my partner and he and I laugh because when we're traveling, we sometimes are like, well, I just made up a story. That's what I think's happening. What do you think is happening? And then we'll find out later we were completely wrong. Our assumptions were completely inaccurate. And so we have to be careful about making assumptions. And that's the value of thinking with others and using tools like the polling apps we just used, using Decision Matrix. Using those tools allows you to bring in other stories and perspectives so you can see the other side. So I went from a simple word cloud, and then I gave you a simple poll, and you could see how we debunked our first assumptions. So anyway, using structured process forces us to make our assumptions more transparent, because the ladder of inferences, we all select the data we want to select when we are analyzing a problem. And we give meaning to that data based on our values. And from that, we make decisions about what to do. And structured processes and asking good questions, the good questions help us hopefully work down that ladder of inference. But structured processes hopefully will make our assumptions, as well as the assumptions of others, especially in a group setting, more transparent. Now, we're not going to use other more structured tools because they do take more time to unpack. But thinking about some basic tools around kind of that, green, yellow, red light, is that red light is assumptions. What's stopping us? What don't we have enough information on? So even when you're trying to think critically, do you step back and think, what do I have for facts? What questions might I still need answered? And what assumptions might I be making? Because if I'm making assumptions, it's time for me to pause and make sure I am engaging others. If I do have questions, have I thought about who the other stakeholders are that I still need to ask? And then what are those clarifying questions? Who are the people that we need to include? And the last one is, what are the facts? What do I know for sure? How do I build on what's working? And so even taking out this is a structured process. It's a very simple structured process of just trying to think about fact, question, assumption, and how do I clarify that information and who do I engage to do that? Okay, so it's more of a team-based thinking process. How do I collect information through a polling app? Or how do I collect that information through a polling app and then using AI potentially to analyze that information in a quick way? Yeah. Words, please, excuse me. All you need to say is excuse me. Yeah. Yeah. So, um, so really, hopefully by doing this, we can think better together by recognizing when we think alone, sometimes that's thin thinking. that we're doing things in order to be effective. We're going to have a wider perspective when we share our thinking with other people, when we use really simple tools, whether it's AI, simple polling tools, or if you come to the class and we teach more structured problem-solving tools, you're creating space to make decisions to think more effectively. And yeah, I love that. So PMP training taught me to always discuss, analyze, review, consult first. Yeah. And so it's a mindset. So as Amy is talking about, part of what she learned isn't it's that reminder that it's a process. The thinking isn't a process, it's not a gut reaction. Okay? It's not a gut reaction. So I want you just in the chat to think about some of what we've talked about. What will you do differently at your next meeting? What's one thing that you're taking away from today that you will either do or think about, whether it's engaging others, using systems, maybe getting a book to sharpen your skills? Okay. I love that. Being more patient, asking for different perspectives. Okay. Asking better questions, trying to understand, being curious, slowing your roll. Love that. Pausing, reflecting, having an open mind. Okay. Approaching situations with curiosity. Okay. So, from these sessions, our hope is always that you will take away at least one or two nuggets that you can apply pretty quickly. We recognize there's a lot of content that you're not going to remember everything, but if you can take one thing home to do differently, with awareness comes change. Practicing one or two things differently will start to up your game and continue to come to these and continue to come to other courses. Yeah. Yeah, not hit the swimmer with your paddle. Absolutely. It's always a smart aleck in every crowd, isn't there, huh? I love the humor though, because we do have to, I think, not hitting the swimmers because we do have to be aware of the impact of all of our decisions. And that's what I made the comment before, and that's part of the heart part of our internal executive decision-making team. So at this point, try to be better than I usually am, and I've left time for some Q&A. So, to the
Yeah,
point is the
thank
asking
you.
questions. Here's your chance to ask those good questions.
Yeah, thanks, Nan. Thanks again for sharing all of your wisdom on this topic. We really appreciate it. At this time, so before we move on to the Q&A portion, we just have a quick short survey for you to take, folks. So if you can share, just kind of how you feel about the content within the webinar. Also, if you use that QR code, that'll bring you to a more in-depth survey. So if you want to provide any other ideas for future presentations, feel free to share those. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then we'll go right into the Q&A portion. I do also want to mention if I don't get to your question, I apologize, but feel free to send those to ccapsinfo@umn.edu, and we'll make sure to pass those on over to Nan.
Thank you, Shanta. Okay. Do I go to the next slide or do you want to leave this up for a minute?
Just leave it up for yet just a little bit longer, and then we can move on to your lovely Q&A slide.
Yeah, like Shanta said, we are always looking to new topics to help meet your needs. So this feedback is important to help us as some of the presenters be more effective, but also to bring some new information to you.
All right, so can go ahead and move on to the next, and we'll go into the Q&A. Let me just pull up these questions here. So again, if you want to add any others in the Q&A, we can go ahead and get those going. So our first question here is, do you have advice for early mid-career employees when leadership is asking for us to be more independent and decisive? My department had specifically requested she not be consulted, that I should not ask her for sign off or approval, but my instinct is to be collaborative and consult subject matter experts and build consensus.
Oh, that's a tough one because that's a cultural issue. Because I think, to your point, I understand the value of building consensus. And actually, if you are newer in your job, we need to support people in helping them gain that some perspective. For me, I might have to ask the question for my supervisor is um, sometimes I like to ask that question that could end up with a no answer. Do you, what's the risk of not engaging others, or what is driving that? And so it may be a productivity issue. Um, so I would actually dive in further with the supervisor to understand that perspective. Maybe it's because they don't feel like you trust yourself and they want you to trust yourself and take the risk. And so I might ask, what's driving that?
Great, thank you. And the next one, how can we better manage meeting flow when over talkers dominate the floor, ensuring there is enough space for deep processors to contribute before the topic moves on?
And that's exactly one of the reasons I love structured processes and using some of the tools like we use today. Okay. There are also um, so we talk about in the online class multi-voting, everyone gets an equal vote. You also have to sometimes have ground rules in your groups about limiting time. Nobody's allowed more than so many minutes in a meeting, or that there is a requirement that every voice is heard. And so if a person has spoken up like two or three times and others haven't spoken yet, it's understood that, thank you, we've heard your opinion. Who else has a perspective here? That we need to hear from. So Lauren Michaels, who was the producer for Saturday Night Live, basically had a ground rule that everyone had to participate, and unless you wanted really long meetings, it meant the rest of those people had to learn to share the space.
Okay, and our next is what happens when a team's leader passes off all of the critical thinking to their team. And then when it comes time to implement, discuss decisions, they finally have something to say that's contrary to their collective team's recommendations or assessments. Why ask for critical thinking, brainstorming when you already know what you want from your decision without disclosing prior?
Well, again, that's a management issue, not a personal critical thinking issue. I see that actually quite a bit, and it is very frustrating for individuals. So, like when I teach the class, one of the things I talk about is know who actually owns the decision. If you're asking for input just to help you make the decision, you need to make that very clear to the team members who are working on the project. Okay. If you want them to make the decision and you want to stretch their critical thinking skills, you also have to be vulnerable and to take the risk to then implement that, because there's nothing that shuts off engagement faster than asking for input and then never using it. So I understand the frustration. Again, you might ask the question of, um, a question I sometimes ask is who has one of the smartest teams in our organizations? And many times the supervisor will be like, well, we do. And then the question is, if we've got the smartest people, what's keeping those ideas from moving forward?
Okay, and next question. Um, How do you recommend finding balance between authority, like a singular decision of a leader, and group decision making?
Well, there's a time and a place for everything. I mean, in an emergency, and sometimes executive decisions have to be made. If your kid was to run out into the street, you're not going to have a committee meeting about, is this the right thing to do? You're going to grab your kid by the back of the shirt and probably pull them off the street. That there are times that executive decisions have to be made. Okay. But this is why many times on teams, you need to be clear about who actually owns the decision and what decisions can be distributed into the organization. And there's a conversation about that when it comes to personnel, maybe those are confidential decisions. When it comes to policy issues that other people have to be are impacted by, those are the kinds of decisions we push out into the organization. Because when it's done inconsistently from department to department, sometimes that causes frustration because individuals do see other teams getting to make decisions that their team doesn't. And so sometimes that's a cultural and organizational choice about how we are going to do this. And I think the most effective managers recognize from that early example I gave you, when you involve people in decisions, they're more likely to be implemented. And that was my comment. Even if it's not 100% solution, if you get buy-in and you create momentum, you can always tweak the decision and take it to the next level further on. But if you don't engage people and they resist, you've slowed down engagement and implementation.
Great, thank you. This goes nicely into the next one. You kind of already answered it, but how do I engage a small team of people who don't like to engage in group discussion or weigh in on decisions?
Well, again, that's the value of using um, some of the virtual tools that you can use. And I think sometimes what people forget, and I hear this a lot, managers will say, well, I ask my team for input, and then they don't give me any input. And what we have to recognize is that it requires trust. If people have worked with someone who's asked for their input, then criticized them and not used it, they can work for a different supervisor and you can ask, but they still have the scars from the prior supervisor. Like, really, can I trust that they're not going to retaliate, or can I trust that they're going to use this? And so it requires asking multiple times and creating the space. Like I said, the Lauren Michael example, he creates the norm, he creates the space, and he creates a process many times. He used to create processes to make sure that there are ways to collect the voices. And so even simple tools like that word cloud allows voices to be heard anonymously, and there's no reason they can't be left open for more than, the 1 minute I left it open.
Great, yeah. So I'll go into the last question then here. How do I engage, oh, excuse me, that was one already said. What would be your best advice when you are balancing time constraints with trying to build team consensus as is related to successful implementation of projects and programs?
Well, part of that is recognizing that consensus doesn't mean everyone gets their first choice. Consensus is, again, using tools to identify what people's options are. And that's why I love a tool that we actually I use in the course called multi-voting, that you come up with as many options as possible, but then you say you give votes for about 20%, people vote, you whittle down the options and you keep kind of sorting through, but everybody gets an equal number of votes and you vote multiple times. And so people feel like they're engaged, but it's pretty quick. And I think learning to use these tools make people less afraid of creating the space to come up with ideas that you're willing to dig into. But most of us don't have enough tools to work through the data quickly that we don't want to get all those ideas. We're overwhelmed.
Yeah, I love that. Definitely take advantage of the tools. I feel like sometimes we're afraid to add new processes into those. But yeah, so we will move on now. So thanks again, Nan. And I apologize to anyone if I missed your question. Again, feel free to send those to ccapsinfo@umn.edu, or even if you have more organization-specific questions, we can definitely pass those along to Nan and
Yes.
get those answered for you. And let me just move on. So, CCAPS now offers flexible workforce development solutions designed to equip employees with targeted knowledge and skills their organization needs. Our programs include industry-driven bachelor's and master's programs, along with over 15 non-credit certificates and 90 individual courses and counting. So, if you want some consultation on that, that's Beth Laurie, our business development manager. You can reach out to her with your questions. The QR code is there as well. And go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we'll send a link to the webinar recording within the week of today's webinar. The recording will also be posted to our CCAP webinar archive as well as our CCAP's YouTube page. And university employees, you are eligible for well-being points to listening for our webinars. So that link has been provided in the chat. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email about that. Nan, did you want to add anything else? I know you had another slide there with the cool quote.
Nope,
No.
my only comment is come take the critical thinking and problem solving course, and I'll give you some specific tools that you can use. So I hope to see you live soon.
Great. And thank you all for joining us today. You all have a good afternoon.